Now it is time for our scripture reading, and it is from Philippians 4 through 7, 11 through 13. You can follow along as printed in the back on the back of your bulletin. Be glad in the Lord always. Again I say, be glad. Let your gentleness show in your treatment of all people. The Lord is near. Don't be anxious about anything. Rather, bring up all of your requests to God in your prayers and petitions, along with giving thanks. Then the peace of God that exceeds all understanding will keep your hearts and minds safe in Christ Jesus. I'm not saying this because I need anything, for I have learned how to be content in any circumstance. I know the experience of being in need and of having more than enough. I have learned the secret to being content in any and every circumstance, whether full or hungry, or whether having plenty or being poor. I can endure all things through the power of the one who gives me strength. This is God's good news for all of God's people.
Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Sean. You bow your heads for prayer. Lord, I ask for your presence in these words. Take them from my mouth, this place, this pulpit, and let those that are gathered here, those that will hear these words, hear you. It is that grace we seek. In your Son's name. Amen. Well, this is the fifth in our sermon series on finding happiness, finding that deeper joy that is our journey towards Easter morning. And we've been using Matt Miowski's book, Happy, What It Is and How to Find It. I've been mining that mercilessly during this last few weeks, and that's been our starting point, and yet we've kind of covered some other ground as we've been in the process. We've talked about some of the obstacles to finding that joy. We started off with talking about things, and nothing was going to make you happy. No thing was going to make you happy, and how we get stuck in the process of collecting and gathering, and sometimes it becomes our obsession. And when our stuff becomes the thing that rules us, it leaves no room for the relationships that truly do make us happy. We even spent an extra week talking about just the relationships themselves and how they really matter in our process or in our trying to become closer to God and to one another, which is where the real joy is found. Last week we dug into forgiveness. And that to be capable of embracing joy, it takes clearing our souls of some of the junk that we've been hanging on to all this time, the grudges and the anger, the fear and the hate. And it's not just for the release that it gives us in our lives, but it also is for the relationships that can, in some cases, be recovered and restored and healed out of that offering of forgiveness and grace to one another. Because again, it's all about the relationships. Messy and imperfect and human relationships that they are. It is there in those moments, in those relationships, with our friends and neighbors, our brothers and sisters, and with God, where we experience God's shalom, God's grace. And that's fine. That's the relationships. That's our connection with one another. But there's still one last part, one piece that we need to think about. One more moment that we might have something that's cluttering up our hearts. And it's that moment when we think, if only I had more money left at the end of the month and fewer bills to pay. If only I could regain my health and be as strong and as vital as I used to be. If only God could heal my broken heart. You see, this might be the last hurdle in our search for happiness, when our circumstances are so overwhelming. How do we find room in our heart that's filled with worry and grief to make room for happiness and joy? How do we find room to live? in the place that we find ourselves at this particular moment in time. It might even be that you might even be a little angry with God at this point. How could God allow? You might be angry with yourself. What did I do to land me here? And that may be the grudge that you carry, and it's just a grudge like anything else, and we need to get rid of that, because it will continue to poison us inside. But if we find ourselves in circumstances, in moments that quite frankly are outside of our range of what we can do about, how does that affect how we live our lives? How does that affect how we deal with our neighbors? If we're so mired in the circumstances that we have, that we're in, that we find ourselves right now. I read an article, and I told Gary that we were going to be talking about the border situation a little bit, and I don't want to talk about the border situation itself, because that's sort of the end result of a much more complicated, much more complex situation. I read a blog during the week about a gal who does community development and family processes and works with people in dire circumstances, in economies that are really struggling. And she spent some time just recently in Honduras. Now, Honduras is one of the three South or Central American countries, just a little bit south of Mexico, that send us a lot of the people that are coming to seek asylum in the United States. And they embark on this scary, insecure, frightening journey. And they don't do it out of whim. They don't do it just because, I think the grass is greener on the other side. They do it because they are escaping absolutely horrible, horrible circumstances. In Honduras, one stat that this gal presented, 95% of the crimes against people, and that's extortion, that's murder, that's rape, that's any of those things, 95% of those violations go unreported. Can you imagine living in a community, in a town, in a country where that was the norm? Drug cartels and gangs have taken over so much of the life in that area, especially in the urban areas. And it extends throughout the country, so even the rural areas are affected by this. Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. The root of the problem that shows up on our southern border as an immigration problem is so much more a community organization, a community wellness problem in the countries that are the countries of origin of the folks that show up at our southern border, knowing that they are most likely going to be turned back. If they do make it across the border, the situation is dire at best. Anything is better than being killed, than finding your family murdered, and facing what they have. Now, I tell you that story just to show you that that's the circumstance that these people are living in, and they're trying their best in whatever way they can to make it a little better. But the ironic thing, the little piece that almost escaped my notice as I was reading this blog, was the thing that she mentioned as she was talking about these people from Honduras city that she was working with, the folks that are down there, trying to develop some economic development in the area despite all of this. And what she said about the people was this: they are wonderful, and they are loving, and they are hospitable people. How do you think they found the ability to be that under those circumstances? You may know someone who can do that in your own life, in your own experience. You may know someone who, despite the circumstances that they find themselves in, is still able to find joy, at least most of the time. And they're able to live it in a way that convinces you that that's really who they are. But how? How do they do it? Paul's letter to the church in Philippi goes to Christians that are living in a fairly prosperous, fairly comfortable Roman colony. It's in the northern part of what we consider the northern part of Greece right now. And Paul writes to these people in their comfort. And yeah, there are some problems, but in reading some of Paul's other work and his other letters to the other churches that he had founded along the way throughout the Mediterranean, where the crises were really considerable. There were schisms and rifts and conflict and stuff going on. But in Paul's letter to the Philippians, there's none of that huge process. Yeah, he talks about, be very careful about heresy and these sorts of things, but mostly it's just a congratulations that you are doing such a good job. He's writing to the people in comfort there, but do you know what situation he's writing from? Paul's in prison. Paul's in jail. He's writing to people in comfort from his position of being in somewhat stress, in crisis. And what he says, Shelley just read to you. Rejoice always. Again, I say rejoice. Be glad. Paul is writing from imprisonment in either Ephesus or Rome, but he takes this opportunity to contrast the good and bad circumstances, the good that he's writing to and the bad that he's writing from. He points out that we should be glad no matter what our current situation. Paul is not blaming God for what is going on there. Rather, he's taking this opportunity to encourage those who suffer as only one who suffers can. It's easy to say in our comfort, don't worry, be happy. I was really tempted to play that song this morning, but I held back. Easy to say that when everything's fine, but it means a whole lot more when you're writing from jail. To tell the world don't worry, rejoice, be glad. Paul is pointing out that our joy is not dependent on our circumstances. It is dependent on God's enduring power and grace that is always bigger than the storm. That storm that we experience in this moment, at this time, in this season of our lives, God's grace is bigger than that. Rejoice always. In Miofsky's book that I keep referring back to, he brings out 4 points that might help us in our situation to find some grace and to find our way through the crises or the situation or the circumstances that we find. And his first point is just live in the present. Be now. Paul says, don't be anxious about anything. Jesus says in the 6th chapter of Matthew, quit worrying about such things. Can worry about any such things? Can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? No. Eastern religions are really good about this, about being in the moment. In that tradition, it's called mindfulness. It's that moment when you try and simply very, very, very strictly be right here in this particular moment. Because, quite frankly, what we do with our past, we blame ourselves for our goof-ups, and we pat ourselves on the back for all the really, really good things that we've done, neither of which is going to help us live today in this moment at this time. Or we look ahead. And a word that I learned just a little while ago, when you take everything that it could possibly go wrong in your life and you pile it all up in a big pile over here, so big that you can't look over the top of it, that's called catastrophizing. When we've taken all of the parts of our lives and we've said, oh my Lord, I can't possibly climb that hill. You see how doing either one of those two things can be so toxic that it takes us out of the moment? And quite frankly, today, this moment, this breath is the only one that God's given you. God doesn't promise you tomorrow. God doesn't want you to focus on yesterday. God gives you today, this moment, this time. Be here. Stop borrowing trouble from the future and stop remembering trouble from the past. Be here. Be now. Whatever happens next is in the hands of a loving God. Do you trust God enough? I mean, Lord knows we sing that song, Amazing Grace, often enough. We need to try and live into that grace that we keep singing about, that might save a wretch like me. Be now. The second thing that Miowski talks about is to change our perspective. Paul's writing from a very unique perspective, and I hope that no one here has had the opportunity to be in that perspective. If you have, don't raise your hand. But Paul's writing from jail. He writes in verse 12, full or hungry, plenty or poor, he's learned to be content. It is hard to see a problem clearly when you are at the bottom of the well. I ran across a blog a while ago, somewhat unlikely particular story. This one particular blogger, he's started a podcast. I'll give you the name of the podcast to kind of tip the hand a little bit. Dylan Marin is the author of this thing, the MC, and he's titled his podcast "Conversations with People Who Hate Me." This guy actually goes out of his way. He reads his feedback in his blog, and the guy that gives him the worst possible feedback, the actual hatred, the white supremacist or the real, the guy that has taken him to task almost unreasonably, who shows real hate. This guy calls that individual up, or gets back in touch, or texts him back, or emails him back, and says, "Let's talk. You want to find a different perspective on how you're living your life? Talk to somebody that disagrees with you. Talk to somebody that sees your life from an entirely different perspective." And that's what this guy does. And yeah, his situation, his response might be a little extreme for you. But imagine what it would be like, what a gift it would be like to look at your problems from somebody else's eyes and to listen, truly listen to what they offer as perspective. I have listened to some of this guy's conversations, and yeah, he doesn't change everybody's mind, but you know what happens? Every once in a while, somebody says, "Yeah, now I can see things from your point of view." And he sees things from theirs, and they talk, and they actually communicate. Imagine if all our problems could be resolved just by talking to somebody that sees things from a different point of view. Maybe sometimes that's a stranger or a friend or somebody that you've known your entire life, or maybe it's you yourself, and all you need is just a break to step away and see things from a different point of view. So these are the other tactics that come with changing your perspective. First of all, stop personalizing everything. Quite frankly, everything is not about you. Surprise. Stop comparing and competing. Life is not a contest. Or like I said, sometimes all it takes is just to stop. Take a step back and look at it from another angle. Change your perspective. The third thing that Miowski talks about is to be grateful. Your mama told you to count your blessings. I'm sure countless people have said, well, all you got to do is sit down with a list and write down the things that are blessings. And you know what? It sounds corny and cliche, and you've always heard it, but it's not bad advice to be grateful. When our focus is so deeply on the storm, on the crisis, on the circumstance that we find ourselves, and we forget that the rest of the world, quite frankly, exists, it might be helpful to broaden our scope and ask ourselves how God has been at work all around us every day of our lives. Now, I have shamelessly asked you guys for weeks now in our prayer time to name when God has been at work in your lives, and it's about this. It's about this moment. Because naming and claiming how God has been at work in our lives broadens our perspective past the individual moment, the circumstances that we find ourselves stuck in right now. And reminds us that God has been with us all along. So go ahead, make a list. Then tomorrow, make another one. And the day after that. And the day after that. Who knows? It might stick. Last but not least, let go. That's the fourth thing, if you're keeping count. There are some things that I will never change in my life. I have come to grips with the fact that I will never play basketball for the University of Missouri at Columbia. My GPA is not that high. And other things. It doesn't matter how many times I get angry, or how many times I post about it on Facebook, or how many times, quite frankly, that I pray about it. What I can do is take responsibility for what I can change and let go of the things that I can't. So what I'd like to do right now is to close the sermon with just this. Now, just to kind of recap a little bit, we're seeking a life of joy, right? We're seeking a life of joy that is greater than our circumstances as we try and first of all live in the present, to change our perspective, to practice generosity, to practice gratitude, and to let go of those things that we cannot control. So I'd like to end with this prayer by Reinhold Niebuhr. Niebuhr was a theologian in the early 20th century, an amazing author, has written books that have trained and taught theologians how to think, how to actually process a little bit. But he wrote this particular prayer at the early third of the last century. It started to surface in a class that he taught to a college group around the early 30s or so, and he didn't really publish it right then, but one of his students remembered enough of it that she wrote it down frantically as she's making notes, and then shared it in her circle, and it started to gain traction. Eventually, that prayer became part of the identity of a group that is dedicated to helping men and women deal with a life-draining, family-crushing circumstance that affects millions. The group was, and is, Alcoholics Anonymous. And the prayer, at least in part, is in our hymnal. And the whole thing goes like this. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, courage to change the things that I can, and wisdom to know the difference. But it goes on. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardships as the pathway to peace, taking as he did this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it. Trust him that he will make all things right if I surrender to his will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with him forever in the next. Amen. Would you bow your heads with me? Lord, that's all we ask. To let go of the things that we know that we cannot change and leave those up to you. To embrace those things that we can change and to work as hard as we possibly can to make life better, not only for ourselves, but for those around us. And Lord, discernment, that wisdom that gives us the grace to know which one is which. Lord, we ask that you would be in our hearts in this church, in this moment. Give us vision that will be far past the storm that rages in our hearts in our lives at present. Give us passion to give that perspective to others whose lives and storms seem to overwhelm them as well. And Lord, grant us your peace. In your Son's name.